Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this talk tonight. My name is Dr. Shane O'Rourke. I'm a historian of Russia. I teach in the history department of the University of York, and I will be the host for tonight's event. It gives me great pleasure, and it's a real privilege to introduce today, to lead this talk, Luke Harding. Luke is an award-winning foreign correspondent with The Guardian. He has reported from Delhi, Berlin, and Moscow, and has also covered wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Between 2007 and 2011, he was The Guardian's Moscow bureau chief. The Kremlin expelled him from the country in the first case of its kind since the Cold War, and in summer 2022, put him on an official blacklist. He's the author of Mafia State and co-author of WikiLeaks, Inside Julian Assange's War on Secrecy, The Liar, The Fall of Jonathan Aitken, which was nominated for the Orwell Prize, and the Snowden Files. Today, Luke will be discussing his book, Invasion, Russia's Bloody War and Ukraine's Fight for Survival, which has also been nominated for this year's Orwell Prize. What we will begin then with is ask for Luke's take on the sort of stunning event that took place this week, the blowing up of the Novokakhovka Dam. So, Luke, what's your take on that on that event? What happened and why?
Thank you, Shane. Hello, everybody. Really terrific to be back at the York Festival of Ideas. You're right. I mean, it's been a tumultuous week. I mean, I know southern Ukraine pretty well. I was there before the invasion. I was in Kherson, the city occupied by the Russians for 8 months last year and then liberated in November. I was there a couple of weeks ago in May, and it's pretty clear to me, having been on the front line, having sort of followed the liberation of the whole Kherson, not just the city of Kherson, but the whole Kherson Oblast, the right bank of the Dnieper River, and driven through the villages there, looked at the Dnieper. It's pretty clear that the Russians did this, and I think the most likely scenario is they just literally blew it up. I mean, bear in mind that the Dnieper is a pretty wide river. The Antonovsky Bridge connecting the right bank of Kherson, where Ukrainians are, with the left bank, which is where, well, there are also Ukrainian civilians, but the Russian military have built huge defensive positions, that this is a kind of hot zone. And the context is everything. And the context is that Ukraine is in the beginnings of a long anticipated counteroffensive. There's a 600-mile front line stretching from the Kherson region all through Zaporizhia, all the way through the Donbass and to the northeast of Ukraine. It's a vast, active front line. And what the Russians have done by blowing up the dam is just unleash this huge torrent of water that makes it practically impossible for the Ukrainians to cross from the right bank to the left bank and to attack Russian positions in a large swathe of southern Ukraine. So there's a clear military strategic reason to do this. The counteroffensive, we think, got underway on Sunday, and then on Tuesday we have this mysterious explosion at 2:50 in the morning. My colleague Piotr Sauer talked to residents in Novokakhovka yesterday who said they had an explosion. They woke up, they didn't know where it came from, and then the sort of sound of water. So, yes, Moscow has formally blamed the Ukrainians, said the Ukrainians did it. They shelled the dam, or they hit it with an American HIMARS missile. That there's no reason why Ukraine would do this. It doesn't make any sense at all. And of course, there's been this kind of vast and terrible suffering that we've seen. I mean, villages deluged on either side, both on the left and the right bank. Some people drowning. A lot of animals have died. Fish have died. I mean, it's a kind of an enormous disaster. And actually, I wrote a big piece about this today for The Guardian. I mean, President Zelensky has called it the worst man-made disaster for decades. And of course, it brings back haunting memories of Chernobyl, the nuclear disaster, which was another kind of technological calamity that left a large chunk of northern Ukraine kind of barren and uninhabited. It still is. and irradiated. And I think it's going to take years to sort this out. And just one, final thought about Kherson, a city I know and like very much. It's just been incredibly luckless. I mean, it was occupied very early on, after the full-scale invasion. The Russians sort of swept in late February of 2022. They then occupied it. Scores of people disappeared, were tortured, abducted, sometimes murdered. Some are still in custody. There was a regime of fear and terror there until the occupying Russians were pushed out in November. And then, pretty soon after that, the Russians, they only retreated about a mile away across the river, have been bombarding the city with mortars, with shells, even with tank rounds. When I was there, a few people on the streets, but not that many. I mean, I was wearing a flat jacket, a helmet, because a few days before, about 25 people had been killed in a sort of massive barrage which hit a supermarket and the train station. And now we have flooding, and it's devastating. And actually, it's pretty devastating for Kherson. But Kherson is a bit elevated, apart from down by the river. But for the other side, occupied cities, places like Novokakhovka itself, but also Aleshki, Gola Pristan, it's been completely swamped. There are people sitting on their roofs as we speak, and from what I've been discovering today, a lot of people are still stuck.
You think this order actually came from the Kremlin, or it was the military on the ground deciding, as a military decision, or do you think it was actually came directly from the Kremlin?
I mean, the dam was mine. I mean, Zelensky actually warned the whole world about this last autumn and said the Russians had mined the dam. That was clearly kind of true. And obviously that was done wittingly. It wasn't done by mistake. And I was talking to a very senior, very, very senior British Army officer, or former British Army officer, who was saying, actually, you don't need special forces or commandos, wearing paint to do this. You just put a lot of explosives at the bottom of the dam underwater. He called them subsurface munitions, and you can blow it up remotely. It's easy peasy, he said. So whether it was done, everything was there for the explosion to go off, and it was done, drunkenly, preemptively, I don't know. But ultimately, this is on Russia. I mean, even if it was some kind of mishap, it was a case of kind of gross negligence. And clearly, you just look at who benefits from this, answer the Russian army benefits, and you can see who the culprit is.
Yeah, I think that's very clear. If we move on from that specific question and come to this, a more general question about your impressions of the war overall. What after a year and 4 months of fighting, what are your impressions of the war now, and have they changed in any way since it began, in February last year?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I spent half of my life in Ukraine. I mean, I was there from pretty solidly from December of 2021, because when like everyone else, I saw this buildup of troops, armored columns, aviation on Ukraine's borders in Belarus and also in occupied Crimea. Excuse me, I sort of feared the worst. I mean, I spent 4 years in Moscow, as you said in your introduction. And basically with Putin, if there's a sort of bad option and a worse option, always bet on the most terrible variation, because that's inevitably where you land. So I really felt that a large-scale military misadventure was brewing. And so yeah, I mean, funnily enough, I drove along the Crimea border in December. I was outside Donetsk with the Ukrainian soldiers. I was in Mariupol in January, just before the invasion. On February the 24th, I was in Kiev when it began. And I think what's changed actually is expectations of Ukraine. I mean, the mood, even inside Kiev, back then at the beginning was very bleak. I mean, the atmosphere was one of kind of fear and dread. And I think most people thought that the Russians would overrun Kiev, actually, and there'd be some kind of partisan conflict. Certainly that was the assessment in Western capitals, in Washington, to some degree in London, I think. But what we've seen is the most extraordinary fight back of the 21st century. We've seen Ukraine push the Russian military out of Kiev and the Kiev region, in spring of last year. And then we've seen these two successful counteroffensives, one in Kherson, which I talked about, and one in the northeast in Kharkiv Oblast, which I also covered. And I mean, Russia continues to occupy about 20% of the country. But my feeling, despite the events of this week, which have not been great for anybody, is that Ukraine now equipped, or the Ukrainian military now equipped with kind of Western equipment, with battle tanks from the UK, from the Germans, from elsewhere, it is on the brink of sort of gaining or regaining the strategic initiative. I mean, how much territory they can liberate this year, I don't know. I don't think they can liberate all of it. I think the war will continue, certainly through 2023, well into 2024. But the other thing to say is that, from this vantage point, we can say that Russia has failed. It's failed in the sense that Putin's objective was to topple Zelensky, to kill him, to install a pro-Russian puppet administration in Kiev, and to turn Ukraine into a colony, to reclaim, as he would see it, a kind of lost province. That project has failed. Actually, the Ukraine has survived. It seems weird to say this, but actually it does have a bright future. The problem is that it has to win the war, and it has to end Russian occupation, and we're still quite a long way away from that.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. The way that the expectations have changed from Ukraine maybe holding out for a week or something, and now suddenly we're people are worrying that maybe the offensive won't be quite the striking success that we all hope it will be. So in a sense that gives a sense of how much expectations have changed as far as you say, as far as Ukraine is concerned. When we look at Russia, when we look at Putin himself, in your book you talk a lot about his essay that he wrote last summer or the summer before about Ukraine and Russia being one people, his sort of imperial fantasies. Could you tell us a bit more about that and explain what you think it is that is driving him?
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of thinking about this in the context of some of the diplomacy and the run up to the full scale invasion. I mean, we saw Emmanuel Macron, for example, fly repeatedly to Moscow to sort of sit with Putin and to try and persuade him to sort of stand down. Macron, I mean, I think he's probably Europe's most brilliant politician, but on that he was kind of profoundly wrong. And what he sort of failed to appreciate is that Putin is in a kind of, I write in my book that he in the run up to the war and subsequently, he was in a strange and unreachable realm. He is, I think we can say fairly confidently that this is kind of late Putin. I mean, it's not quite the end of Putin, but I think if this were a Shakespearean play, it would be Act 5. I'd say by now it's probably Scene 2, maybe shading into Scene 3, and we don't know how it's going to end, but Putin basically is a dictator who, like all dictators, has become increasingly erratic, and who we can also say had a really bad pandemic. I mean, he was terrifically isolated. He's someone who's very isolated anyway. He doesn't use a mobile phone. He doesn't use the internet. He relies on briefings from his spy agencies, from the FSB and the SVR, Foreign Intelligence Service, the GRU, and on a very small number of people. And really the sort of defining image of this slightly bizarre era is Putin, a rather small man. I mean, I've been in a room with him, sitting at one end, 10 meters away of a very long table from someone else. And during COVID, he basically sat in his residence outside Moscow and he called up history books. And he seems to have read a lot of Solzhenitsyn, who's the kind of link figure between the sort of Soviet, post-Soviet era. And he has convinced himself, I mean, he wrote this essay, as you say, that Ukraine was never a state, a thing, a people, a country, a sovereign entity, that it is, it's a fiction, and that the only reason that and also he stresses the sort of common, as he sees it, civilizational origins between Ukraine and Russia. He goes all the way back to the 9th century, to Kievan Rus, to Prince Volodymyr. And essentially, he's saying that this whole region, including Belarus, has always been linguistic, cultural, spiritual space, and it's Russian space. And so what he sees himself as doing, crazy as it seems, by invading Ukraine, is he sees himself as a sort of great restorationist, that he is putting together something that has been sundered by the Mongols, by the Poles, by the Germans, by Lenin. He blames Lenin for creating the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic in the 1920s. And of course, by the perfidious West, his arch enemy, America, and its satellites, including the UK. And he sees himself as a kind of great restorer rather than a wrecker. Whereas, I mean, this is delusional, but I mean, I think what's striking about his ideas is these are not Marxist-Leninist ideas. As I said, the Bolsheviks are villains here. They are classic imperialist ideas from the 19th century, actually, and ideas such as narodnost or nationality. And the problem with these ideas is that you hop from imperialism, basically, which is what it is. It's an imperial project to get back a kind of lost, refractory province, as Putin sees it. You go from these imperial ideas to what I would argue is fascism, 21st century fascism, because in Putin's kind of very binary worldview, Ukrainians do not exist. These are Russians. And either Ukrainians under Russian occupation can be turned into good Russians, they can be kind of re-Russified. And once you understand that, you understand why Russia is abducting Ukrainian children and taking them away, because they have to be re-educated. And if they can't be made into good Russians, they have to be destroyed. So those are the options. The options are, submit and embrace your true Russian identity and allegiance, or be destroyed. And to my mind, that's fascism.
Yeah, I mean, one of the striking things, that's come out from this war is this. He often, as he says, refers to the Ukrainians as a brother people. We're all, as you say, we're all part of one great big family here. But the other side of that, as you say, is a project that at times appears frankly genocidal. I mean, I listen sometimes to the various talk shows on Russian television, and that language is explicitly genocidal. I think that what they're aiming for is the destruction of the Ukrainian nation, of the Ukrainian state, and as you said, for those who can't accept that, their physical extermination. What is your take on the question of genocide? I mean, it's a word that's used too easily, and people throw it around very lightly. But in this particular case, what do you think?
I mean, I think it is genocide, and it started off. I mean, bear in mind, that Putin already annexed Crimea in 2014, but even before that, the rhetoric on Russian state television towards Ukrainians was, I mean, first of all, it was fantastically, patronizing and condescending, but it was also increasingly dehumanizing. I mean, Ukrainians were depicted as Nazis, or as vermin, or as rats, and of course this sort of sinks into the sort of popular Russian consciousness, and it shaped what happened subsequently. But the project is clear. The project is to wipe Ukraine from the map, to de-Ukrainize Ukraine, and we've seen it in action. I've seen it in action. I mean, in areas of Russian occupation, the Ukrainian language is immediately banned. Ukrainian books are burned or carted off. Statues of Taras Shevchenko, the great 19th century Ukrainian national poet, are blown up. Or, there's a famous one in Borodyanka in the Kiev region, which I've seen a couple of times, where someone shot Shevchenko, the statue, in the head. And so it's explicit. It's not subtle or covert. The goal is to destroy Ukraine as a culture. And what Ukrainians will tell you is that this is not a recent project, that it's been going on for hundreds of years. I mean, funnily enough, the first books to be banned in Ukrainian were back in 1622. And we had a long period in the 19th century where There were edicts banning the publication of Ukrainian poems, preventing Ukrainian plays from being staged. That only stopped in about 1905. Then, of course, we had the whole sort of disaster, tragedy of the Holodomor, the Stalin's artificial famine in 1932, 1933, which killed about 4 million Ukrainians, which was also engineered and explicitly kind of political. So there's been this absolute history of Russian imperialism and Russian terror going back a very long way. And what the Ukrainians say they're trying to do is kind of emancipate themselves from that. And the point is that for Ukrainians, it's existential. They understand that if Ukraine goes down as a state, first of all, they can be murdered, tortured, enslaved if they fall into Russian hands. But secondly, Ukraine ceases to exist. So you put all that together and look at what happened in places like Bucha, which I can talk about if you like. And to my mind, that's genocide.
Yeah. Could you tell us a bit more about your experiences in Bucha? Because when I was reading it, it came across as intensely personal, not an abstract discussion of, killings, but actually something that, was quite visceral for you. Could you sort of share some more feelings on that with us, please?
Yeah, I mean, Shane, the sort of the backstory is that I've done a lot of war reporting. I mean, I'm not new to this. I've been on The Guardian about 25 years. I've been a foreign correspondent since 2000, based in Delhi. I covered the war in Afghanistan first time around. I was in Iraq. I've been in Syria. I did the war in Georgia when Russia staged an invasion in 2000, a mini invasion in 2008. And I was in Donetsk and Luhansk in 2014 when Putin took Crimea and kickstarted a war in the east of the country, effectively sort of stealth annexing an eastern chunk as well as formally annexing Crimea. So I've seen bad stuff, but actually what happened in Bucha is as bad as anything I've seen. And essentially what happened was that this Russian advance, as we were discussing, the Russians came in from Belarus through the Chernobyl, seized the Chernobyl nuclear complex, and then kept going through these kind of primordial forests and bogs, and were expecting that they'd be greeted as liberators, because that's what they've been told, that the Ukrainians would greet them with flowers. And in fact, Ukrainians greeted them with fire and with fury. And these columns got smashed up. And they stopped on the outskirts of Kiev in Bucha, Irpin, these sort of little green sort of satellite towns with pine trees and dachas, cottages and so on. And these frustrated soldiers took it out on the civilian population. I mean, they raped Ukrainian women, they shot up civilian cars, killing families, children. They abducted Ukrainian men. It was just absolute terror. And I went in the aftermath of their retreat. I mean, they left at the end of March last year. I went a few days later to Bucha, and I went to go and see a woman called Tanya who lived in Taras, no, not Taras Shevchenko. It was Ivano-Frankivsk Street. And her nephew had been seized by a bunch of Russian soldiers. They'd come to the door with guns. They'd asked to see everyone's phones. Nephew Volodymyr or Volodya had handed over his phone, and he had taken photos of a Russian column that had been smashed up on Railway Street. They found these photos. They just said, "You're coming with us." Marched him out into the cold in his T-shirt and flip-flops. And Tanya then showed me the house down the road which the Russian officers had set up as a kind of HQ. And a couple of hours later, she shinned up an apple tree, peered in to see that these Russian soldiers were interrogating her nephew, Volodya. They'd broken his arm. He was covered in blood. He was sobbing. He said he hadn't done anything. He hadn't seen anything. And then a couple of hours later after that, he was marched out into the street. They managed to give him some warmer clothes and some shoes. He was put in the back of an armored personnel carrier and driven off. And the soldiers were parked in her street. And so she asked them what had happened to him the next day. They said he was being interrogated, he would be returned. And so for 3 weeks, as this killing spree was underway, they believed that Volodya was alive. And then she took me further down the street, about a couple of minutes walk away. We went down the street and we turned right to an abandoned house. And basically, the day they left, a neighbor came around and said, "Oh, we found a body." And she showed me this outbuilding. And I can't get it out of my head. I mean, she wouldn't go down, but I went down into the cellar, which was dark. It smelt of human decay. There was a mattress covered in blood lying there, and a kid's toy, children's toy. And basically, they'd kept Volodya there for some days, we don't know how long. And then one night, they'd come down. He's a 24-year-old guy, and they made him kneel and they shot him in the back of the head. They just executed him and left him there, left his body there. And they did this, Russian soldiers did this to about 1,600 people in the Kiev region. I went to Izum, which is in the northeast, which was also which was liberated last November, and I watched as Ukrainian sort of forensic guys in boiler suits exhumed bodies one by one in this. It was an existing cemetery, but with a new mass grave, with wooden crosses, and it was bucolic. There were pine trees, there were birds singing, and you would just watch as they dug, and then they produce a corpse, and you would see that it had camouflage trousers and boots. Sometimes the hands were tied. In other words, these were Ukrainian prisoners who had been taken prisoner, interrogated, tortured, and were then executed. Sometimes it was a smaller body, probably a woman's body, but you couldn't always tell. I mean, it was very hard. They'd been in the ground for some time. And I try to write about this vividly and well, because it's important that people understand. It's important that people don't forget, that they know what's going on. This isn't in some faraway place. This is happening in Europe. This is happening now. This is happening in the 21st century. I think what's happening in Ukraine is our kind of 1930s moment, actually. You mentioned George Orwell, my book being nominated for the Orwell Prize. And I think Orwell would have recognized similarities between his own dark era and our own. This is European fascism once again. I mean, totalitarianism in the shape of today's Russia, it didn't go away. It's come back. Never went away, really. So we need to be clear, what's at stake. And just sorry, one last thing, ultimately, yes, my book is about geopolitics. Yes, it's about the way that this conflict has reshaped international relations, brought Britain back in from the cold, so it's talking to its European neighbors, rejuvenated NATO. I would say boosted the West, actually, which now has remembered what the West stands for, whether it's democracy, self-determination, and so on. But ultimately, this is a tragedy about individuals who are sometimes being abducted, sometimes executed in the middle of the night.
Yeah, it's horrific, and as you say, the hard thing to grasp is that it's Europe. That we thought we'd gone beyond this. That we'd put this behind us forever, especially with the end of the Cold War, and now we seem to be back in the 19th century.
We went backwards. That's the problem, and I think people need to be very kind of clear-eyed about what's going on, and also that we don't lose interest or turn the news off or flick channel, because this conflict is by no means over. And what the Ukrainians sort of say, I think correctly, is that hey, this is not just our war, this is also your war, because if the Putin regime is not stopped, it will keep going. And I think that's true. I mean, I think after Crimea, who would have thought that Putin would then launch the biggest sort of military conflict in Europe since 1945? Well, he has. If he prevails in Ukraine, then I think Moldova looks pretty weak and vulnerable. The Baltic states as well. I mean, Putin doesn't like them. He hates Poland. Russian state TV is talking about nuking Berlin and London practically every week. This is an enormous problem, for us, for our continent. And it's not just their problem, Ukraine's problem, it's also our problem.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point to get across, because so often when you see people arguing that basically Ukraine should trade land for peace, and as if that will be the end of the story. And to me, it seems there's a complete failure to understand the nature of the regime that they're dealing with and what Putin's ultimate aims are.
Yeah, I mean, Putin still thinks he can win. I mean, partly perhaps because people don't like bringing him bad news in the way of all despots. He just wants to hear good news, but he thinks he can win. I mean, his goal to subjugate and to wipe out Ukraine is unchanged, and moreover, he thinks he has the stamina for a long war, and that the West, you know, Russia's eternal enemy as he sees it, will eventually flake. You know, that sooner or later, you know, governments will change. I mean, democratic politicians are quite ephemeral compared to dictators. I mean, that people will get fed up with high energy prices, or with the cost of the war, or they'll get bored, or Donald Trump, God help us, will return in 2024 and immediately cut military aid to Ukraine, and this will create opportunities for Russia on the battlefield and also internationally. So he wants a long war. He's quite content to smoosh Kiev with ballistic missiles. I mean, I came from Kiev recently, and the problem in Kiev these days is, you know, the good news is that Ukrainian air defenses work pretty well in Kiev, so most missiles get shot down. Not all of them. I mean, you know, but the problem is, you know, some people then die. But the biggest issue is that you don't sleep because there's an air raid siren goes off practically every night at 2 a.m. It's very, very loud. It's not something you can ignore. And even if you do ignore it, about 10 minutes later, you hear explosions in the sky, and you look out on the balcony. That there are Ukrainian air defenses, you know, shooting tracer fire. There are bangs, there are booms, and you know, by 4 a.m, when it normally settles down, you're so full of adrenaline you can't sleep then either. And this happens night after night. And so Putin's strategy is attritional. He wants to wear us down. He wants to make us disengage. He wants politicians to conclude that actually concessions have to be made to Russia. And you know, we can't let that happen. I mean, we have to stick with it.
Yeah. Yeah, this brings me to another point then. I mean, you're someone who lived in Moscow, you know the political scene there extremely well, you know, you a deep grasp of Russian history. This idea that Russia can just go on indefinitely, you know, throwing men at it, throwing resources, suffering, it seems to be widely fixed, you know, based, I presume, largely on the Second World War, what happened then. But when I read the Russian military bloggers, they're talking quite openly and frequently about a new time of troubles, that actually the Russian state isn't as strong as, you know, we in the West imagine, that actually that, you know, there are fracture lines there, that the longer this war goes on, that, you know, it's not just the West that might get tired, but actually the Russians themselves. How do you react to that?
Well, I mean, that's interesting, and of course there was a lot of speculation, certainly last year, that there might be a palace coup that would remove Putin from power, or possibly that he was terminally ill, and that you know, we wouldn't have to worry about that because he would just croak. I mean, he hasn't croaked, and I think this expectation of a coup was probably, unfortunately, based on people watching The Death of Stalin, the wonderful Armando Iannucci dark comedy. You know, that there has been no death of Stalin. I mean, the one thing I know from my sources from European intelligence agencies sort of tell me that their only data point is that Putin has fantastic medical care. He has a team of brilliant consultants and physicians who are with him all the time. So he, you know, he has certainly shown better medical care than you and I. So that's not going to work as a scenario. And also he I mean, Russia has gone from being, I would say, a kind of soft authoritarian power when I was living in Moscow, and Dmitry Medvedev was briefly president or pseudo president. I mean, he was never really president. Putin was always calling the shots. To being a sort of totalitarian state where any dissent has been criminalized, where all of the really good Russian journalists, independent Russian journalists I used to work with, they've all fled, where opposition people I used to see have either been murdered or they've been locked up, like Alexei Navalny or Vladimir Karamurza, who's a very brave and brilliant guy who went to British University and was arrested last April when he was back in Moscow. So civil society has gone. A lot of people have left. The oligarchs, who are quite noisy, have gone very quiet. A lot of them have been sanctioned. And I think Putin quite likes this. I mean, he's a KGB guy down to his fingertips. He likes having virtually complete control of Russian society. Most Russians, I would say, sort of soft support the war because they've been conditioned by years of propaganda and television, which is still the main information resource. And sorry, just one other point before we go to questions, which is that I think the West is also culpable for this situation. I mean, Putin has done outrageous and terrible things, from murdering Alexander Litvinenko. I wrote a book about that, A Very Expensive Poison, and talked about that book last time I was at the York Festival Ideas, poisoning the Skripals, annexing Crimea, and so on and so on and so on, trying to subvert Western politics and helping Donald Trump win in 2016 by hacking Democratic Party emails, by leaking and dumping. And the reaction from the West has been unimaginative, it's been conventional, it's been weak. And so Putin has kept on gambling, he's kept on escalating, and it's culminated in Ukraine. And what I was going to say was there's been a lot of finger pointing at the Germans, saying, oh, the Germans, they became addicted to Russian oil and gas. They thought they could sort of separate trade from the darkening politics inside Russia, et cetera, et cetera. But in this country, maybe not so much in York, but certainly in London, we were as bad, if not worse. We became addicted to Russian money, right? We let oligarchs buy our football clubs, buy up our country houses, buy up most of West London, send their kids to private schools, hire peers, both Conservative and Labour, for their boards of their kind of enterprises. A recent British Prime Minister made the son of a KGB officer a peer. I shan't name him in case his lawyers are watching, but I think you know who we mean. So we're also very to blame for the situation we're in now.
Which brings me to the one sort of light-hearted moment in your book, just before we go to the questions, is Boris Johnson's frequent visits to Ukraine. What did you make of those?
Oh, God. Well, I mean, I think I can say, I'm revealing no secrets, that I'm not a fan of Boris Johnson. I think he's been a calamitous prime minister. But the one area of disagreement I have with my Ukrainian friends is over him. I say, look, he's a liar. He's a cheat, and God, don't put him in a taxi with your daughter, et cetera, et cetera. And they go, no, we love him. He's brilliant. He's ridiculous. And he's not ridiculous. He's a great guy. And in Ukraine, I wander downtown in Kiev. I go past an art gallery there, and I look in the window, and there's a picture of Boris Johnson dressed as a Cossack playing a lute. I go to Kryvyi Rih, Zelensky's hometown, to interview refugees, and then the building, the wall opposite, a young woman from Odessa is painting a 30-foot tall Boris Johnson mural of Johnson going like this. I'm in a taxi and someone puts the radio on, the driver puts the radio on, and there's a Boris Johnson rap song. You can Google it. It's a complete earworm. And it's a rapper from Western Ukraine. And the chorus line is Boris Johnson in English, with an English accent saying, Dobry Jen, everybody. He's inescapable. And I think if he did one good thing in his godforsaken and terrible premiership, it was to support Ukraine. And I think he does deserve some credit for that, because actually at a time when everyone else was thinking about Ukrainian failure, he was talking about Ukrainian victory back in February and March. And he was also there in April of last year. I was there too, when Kiev was had an 8 p.m. curfew. There was nowhere to eat. It was cold. It was gloomy. The Russians were close by. So he was a little bit brave as well. So a disaster in the UK, but in Ukraine, I think we have to acknowledge that he did some good stuff.
His finest hour, no doubt.
His finest hour, and he was very conscious of that. I mean, it was a bit of a Churchill,
Yeah.
cosplay thing, but nonetheless, by Ukraine, he did the right thing.
He finally got his chance. Great. Okay, if we go to the questions now, I'll start with one which takes a very different point of view from the tenor of our discussion. It's from GZ. It just says, why is the West continually focused on supplying Ukraine with more weapons and less on negotiation for peace?
Okay. Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, there is a sort of there's a kind of narrative on the left and the right that actually, giving weapons to Ukraine prolongs the war in some way. I mean, the problem is that it's Bucha and Mariupol. I mean, we've seen what happens in areas of Russian occupation. We know similar things are going on in the south of the country, if Ukraine has no weapons, then it goes under, and then we're talking about millions of people being subjugated. I mean, about 4 million people already living under Russian rule, and you now understand what that means. And the other point is, negotiate, with whom about what? I mean, the fact is that, as I said, Putin still believes he can win. Any sort of peace deal which swapped land for peace, I think, would last about 5 minutes. I mean, let's say theoretically that, Zelensky agreed to cede large chunks of the south of the country in exchange for peace. It's pretty clear that the Russian state would use this time to regroup, to reorganize, and to build back the Russian army with a view to attacking Ukraine again. In other words, a peace deal would not mean peace. And I'm pretty certain that the Russians would violate it within days, if not within hours of the paper being signed. So that's not going to work. The corollary of that is that Ukraine has to keep going until it wins, until it actually evicts the Russians and is strong enough to defend itself, and that requires support from the West. So a deal is never going to fly. And one final point: were Zelensky to sort of sign a kind of land for peace deal, which he's not going to do, then so many Ukrainians have been killed, 500 children, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. Mariupol, a city I know, which used to have, a flourishing city of 400,000 people, is now smoke and ash. The mood is so vehement. People are so angry. They're so furious with Russia. No, any president who signed concessions would immediately be removed. There'd be enormous street protests, and it would be the end of it. So the Ukrainians have to keep going, and I think they deserve our support and should get our support.
Great, thank you for that. Next question is from Ben. He says, there have been lots of news stories that give the impression that Russia militarily is really struggling, e.g. untrained men being pressed into service, use of convicts, lack of ammunition for the Wagner group, etc. How much do you think Russia has left militarily? And any thoughts on what happens next if the Russian invasion does collapse?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Ben. It's an interesting question. I mean, I don't see the Russian army collapsing. I think what Ukraine is hoping is that they will be able to, a bit like last year, that they will be able to sort of punch through the Russian lines. And by the way, the Russians have constructed some of the most extensive fortifications on the planet that we've seen for decades. I mean, massive tank traps. They've mined the whole of southern Ukraine. It's going to be very hard for the Ukrainians to go forward. But the hope is that with new Western equipment, that they'll be able to kind of, the strategic goal is to sort of separate the land corridor connecting Crimea and Kherson and Zaporizhia with the eastern Donbass region. If they can do that, that's an enormous success, but it's a very, very big if. I mean, the thing about Russian soldiers is generally they're badly trained, they're less professional, they're definitely less motivated than the Ukrainians. Many of them don't really want to be there, but the point is there are an awful lot of them. I mean, Russia is just a bigger country, and it's military. It's this kind of clumsy monster, but it's a very big monster, and it's going to be really hard to defeat the monster. That's the problem. And the happy story is saying the Russians are running short of this and of that, but I think the bottom line is they still have a lot of tanks. Most of their newer tanks have been destroyed. They've got a lot of older tanks, a lot of older armored vehicles, Meanwhile, Russia is turning itself into a war economy. It's stepping up production of ammunition and artillery shells. And as I was saying, they're anticipating, they're planning for a very long war. So unfortunately, Russia is weaker than we thought a year ago, but it's also stronger than we might hope it would be.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Another question now from Peter Jarman. He says, the weapons are winning in Ukraine, the people are not. Would non-violent resistance to the invasion save the people, whilst the state would be overrun, as happened to Czechoslovakia from 1968 to 1991? So
I think the problem, the problem is that there is no scope for non-violence now. And again, I think, I just go back to Bucha and Mariupol. I mean, so many civilians there were killed, guys on bikes, old men, marauding Russian soldiers, just putting people out of their houses and shooting them in courtyards. Yeah, I mean, on my most recent trip, I talked to a woman whose husband was killed in Mariupol. They were living on a 9th floor apartment block. She's called Natasha, and she's a journalist. And this was pretty early on in March, that the city was being bombarded, and she was in one room in the kitchen. Her husband was in the living room, and 2 shells landed on the roof. And she discovered her husband was dead. She had to flee with her 13-year-old son, and with her mother. She left her husband's body there. She spent 6 months trying to establish where he'd been buried. He was just an anonymous number in a mass grave. And in that kind of situation, I mean, non-violence doesn't work, because the other side is just very willing to kill you, quite randomly, actually. In fact, by pulverizing residential neighborhoods with massive munitions and airdrop bombs. So actually, Ukrainians, all of them, they want victory. They support Zelensky. I mean, I write a lot about Zelensky because he's an interesting person whose popularity ratings were going down until the invasion happened, and actually has played an extraordinary role in consolidating his country and amplifying the kind of national spirit of resistance. And everybody is helping. Everyone is working towards Ukrainian victory. I mean, and the difference between Ukraine and Russia is that Ukraine is a very horizontal society. It's very networked. I describe it as a sort of super organism. So people are raising money for drones. They're buying cars in Poland and donating them to the Ukrainian military. They're hosting refugees. They're cooking soup. Today, they're going out in boats and rescuing people who've been stuck in the floods. And Russia, by contrast, is a far more vertical society where people just obey because they're quite often kind of coerced or browbeaten into doing things. So there are kind of 2 models here. But the only solution for the Ukrainians, and that they understand this, they'll tell you this, is a military solution.
Yeah, that seems to me to be true. I mean, when you're dealing with a regime like Putin's, who would regard non-violent resistance with contempt or utter contempt, and just as an invitation to trample all over people, I think I can't see how it would work in this situation, a non-violent resistance, given the brutality of the Putin regime.
Yeah.
This is a question from Etta. She says, I'm not sure if there's a he or a she, but anyway, Luca and Shane, with all your expertise on what's going on in Russia and knowing Putin will die someday, even if he's not overthrown sooner, who are the likely candidates who might take over? And would they be better or worse? How would you answer this?
That's actually a really interesting question. Thank you very much. Oh, and by the way, if there's anyone who's actually Ukrainian who's watching, I'd love to hear from you. If you can, say that you're Ukrainian in the chat, and we'll jump your question up. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because basically, the heart of it is, does Putin basically sort of create the system in Russia, or does the system throw out Putin? And most Ukrainians tell me, and I agree with them, that Putin in a way is a sort of concentrate of Russian thinking and Russian mentality, and as they see it, Russian chauvinism. And therefore that means that were Putin to kind of topple over, that any successor would probably have the same sort of prejudices. I mean, there would definitely, if Putin dies, there'll be a hiatus in the war because there'll be a massive factional struggle between people at the top of the Kremlin for power. And bear in mind that those people are worth billions of dollars. So it's not just about power, it's also about money and about personal survival as well. So you know, any successor, well, first of all, I can tell you it won't be a woman. It'll be another man, probably a rather short man. But also it'll be someone who believes in great Russia as Putin does, and probably someone with a kind of security intelligence background. I mean, someone who seems to be auditioning for the role of president, or at least trying to make himself relevant, is Yevgeny Prigozhin, the oligarch who is the mercenary leader of the Wagner Group, whose troops have been fighting around Bakhmut and in Bakhmut in the east, where the battle has been raging for months. And what's interesting about Prigozhin is that he's been remorselessly criticizing Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, Gerasimov, the Russian sort of commander-in-chief. He hasn't been criticizing Putin directly, although he has a little bit obliquely. And I mean, you know, I think Putin allows Prigozhin to say these things because he likes keeping the factions off balance and at odds with each other. But in a way, Prigozhin is the sort of president that Putin isn't, because Putin, as Alexei Navalny puts it, is a bit of a cowardly little man who hides in a bunker all the time, whereas Prigozhin is genuinely on the front line. He posts these kind of macabre videos surrounded by the corpses of fallen Wagner mercenaries. He complains constantly that the Ministry of Defense is not giving his guys enough ammunition. And he's kind of brave. He's a sort of ultra-nationalist. He shoots his mouth off. I think, I don't know if he has presidential ambitions or he's just trying to survive, but he's, I would say now, certainly the most interesting kind of personality in this kind of Kremlin political swirl. But whether he's still alive in a year or two, years time, I don't know.
Yeah, he looks like a real Bond villain, actually. I mean,
he's straight out of Central Casting. I mean, he's terrifically ugly as well. He's got this kind of rubber face. He's enormously bald, and to be trivial, I mean, because I'm not trivializing, but just to be kind of upbeat for a moment. I mean, there is a sort of joke in Russian succession that it goes hairy man, bald man. I mean, Putin's quite bald, so by rights it should be another hairy man, which suggests that it's not going to be Prigozhin.
Even if Ukraine expels the Russians, this is from Mike Ward, actually says, even if Ukraine expels the Russians from all its territory, that doesn't seem likely to guarantee peace. Should Ukraine be allowed to join NATO?
I mean, I think yes, actually. I mean, it's sort of, and just to be clear on NATO, Putin basically said the reason he was, or one of the reasons he was invading Ukraine or doing a special military operation was NATO. But the fact is that Finland has joined, Sweden's about to join, and Putin, scarcely blinked. I mean, it's pretextual. It was never really about NATO. It was about all the things we discussed earlier, essentially about reclaiming, restoring this lost province and teaching the Americans a lesson. The fact is that the government in Ukraine is democratic. I've covered various elections there. I was in Ukraine in 2019, and Petro Poroshenko, the then president, who'd done one term, really wanted to do a second term. He did not want to lose that election. He was desperate to cling on, and he was thrown out in a Zelensky landslide. So Ukraine is a plural state. It's a democratic state. And support for NATO is now enormous. Support for joining the European Union is also very high. I mean, Ukraine has irrevocably decided that it should integrate with the West and with Western institutional security structures. So, and I think after, and they also say, look, we are fighting Russia for you because if not us, then you're next. And that, as I was saying, I think there's some validity to that argument. So I think Ukraine should join NATO. But the problem is it's very hard for them to join when the war still rages. But I think they have their army. It has enormous battlefield experience. I mean, this is the biggest battle in Europe since the Second World War, and I think they should be allowed to join. I think we should support their endeavour.
Yes, I agree with you completely there. Here's a question from Stephen Torno. He says, once Ukraine wins and reclaims its territory, how do you see the reintegration of the Lugansk and Donetsk regions? How extensively has Russia been able to bring Russian settlers and or removed Ukrainian citizens since 2014?
That's a great question. And just briefly, because we're running out of time, I actually think it's going to be easier, paradoxically, to reintegrate Crimea, where there are Crimean Tatars, the original, Muslim population there who are pro-Ukrainian, and actually, Crimea has always been quite kind of sort of free thinking. It'll be easier to get Crimea back and to reintegrate it than Donetsk and Luhansk, and for two reasons. I mean, firstly, many of the middle classes, educated people with pro-Ukrainian views, they all fled. They all left in 2014, and the population that are there at the moment have had 9 years of watching Russian TV. They are vehemently anti-Ukrainian or Ukrainian governments, and those territories have been sort of stealth annexed. So there is not a supportive constituency. I mean, there's a mixed constituency in Crimea. There's not a supportive constituency in Donetsk, Luhansk for Ukrainian troops. So getting them back is going to be very difficult. It's going to be additionally difficult because these areas are right next to Russia. They've been basically integrated with Russia, and military supply lines there are very close. So it's going to be hard, but I also think it's the right thing to do. I mean, I would just say, if you read one novel after my talk, read Serhiy Zhadan's book. He's actually from Luhansk, and he's written this brilliant novel called The Orphanage. He's just been in the UK. It was Internat in Ukrainian. And what's so brilliant about the novel, it's written after 2014 and the Russian takeover, is that he has a very strong civic sort of pro-Ukrainian position, but he has empathy for both sides. And in some kind of fantastical world, it would be great to see Zhadan as a kind of plenipotentiary envoy to a liberated Luhansk and Donetsk, as someone who can find a way through this and bring the country back together again after the horror of what's happened over the last 9-10 years.
Great. Okay, then. Just one more. Rachel has asked, is there a link to the Zoom and to the YouTube recording of this, which there will be, so you should be able to get it without any problem. Well, that just remains now just to thank you, Luke, for a really stimulating talk, very interesting, and one that also raised, as we can see from the questions, a lot of very interesting questions. So again, it's been a real pleasure and a privilege to speak with you, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of the University of York and all our audience for your participation and for giving of your time and expertise so freely and generously. So this has been a real pleasure. Thank you, Luke.
Yeah, thank you, Shane. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I mean, normally you sort of say Slava Ukraini, but I think we should also add Slava York Festival of Ideas. I'm not quite sure how one says it in the dative case, which is what you need, but Slava York Festival of Ideas. And thank you very much. And my final sort of parting idea is, please stay with Ukraine. Please watch it, read Ukrainian poets, read Ukrainian novels, watch the news, help if you can. It's really important, and they deserve our moral support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for listening. I do hope you found it as stimulating as I did. Thank you and goodbye.